Okay. It's a great pleasure to introduce Antonio Torralba as our distinguished lecture series speaker today. I've known Antonio for a while. If I give a proper coverage of everything he has done in computer vision, he will not have any time to give a talk, so I'll try to be brief. Among the things he has done are a lot of really pioneering data sets. I think he collected the first egocentric video data set in computer vision, walking around with a hat with a camera that he put together with Ken Murphy. He created definitely some of the first large-scale data sets in computer vision, the famous tiny images data set, the Places 365. His work on data was recognized, among other awards he received, by the Mark Everingham Prize for contribution to computer vision community in 2020. He has done some of the pioneering work on understanding what learning models learn about the vision. He had famous work on showing that if you train a model to classify images, it actually learns to detect objects, and many other pieces of work like that. He has done a lot of work on understanding how attention works, especially his earlier work, how we can prime visual systems to better know where to look, what to look for, and better understand images and scenes. He's done a lot of work. I think today he will actually tell us more about work on understanding what these models do. And I will pass it to him. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, hi everybody. I'm happy to be here. It's the first time I'm at TTIC, so it's pretty exciting. So the title is Understanding Large Vision Models, but I need to reveal a secret. We are not going to understand anything. So just to be upfront with you. So let me start telling you that when we started, some of the things that Greg has been talking about are pretty old works, and it was a fantastic time. It was what I call the benchmarks golden age, around the year 2000, 2015, where everybody was collecting data, annotating images, and we could actually measure the performance of systems. And then you could take a picture like this one, run the state-of-the-art object detection system. It will tell you there is a car over there, and it was great. Okay? It was fantastic. Everybody knew that it was wrong, that you could do better than this, and everybody was happy. We are not living in that time anymore. Now we have systems that can do amazing stuff. We don't know actually what they can do and what they cannot do. We don't know how to evaluate them. You can take something like ChatGPT, put it a high school math problem, like this one here, you say, a treasure hunter found a buried treasure chest filled with gems. There were 175 diamonds, 35 fewer rubies than diamonds, and so on and so on. How many gems there are in the chest? And ChatGPT gives you an answer, writing what is the unknown, what are the different equations that you need to solve, and at the end it tells you there are 225. Which is wrong, but who cares? It's written in beautiful English, it's everything very justified, it's just amazing. And these systems can do actually pretty amazing stuff. In fact, every time that you ask the same question to ChatGPT, it always tells you something different. So the first time, it got it wrong, but if you ask it again, it just happens to get it right. And then two students, Yulun and Xuan, well, now they are faculty, they did something quite interesting, which was to have these two different agents have a debate. And now you can say, well, I got two different versions. You don't know which one is right. So you tell to the first agent, wait, there is a different version of you that says something different. And you just copy paste the answer. And you ask, what do you think now? And it says, well, after reviewing the answer, yes, I agree that there is something, I agree with the other agent's answer. So the real response is 595, which is right. But because you don't know which one is right, you do the same thing with the second one, and it actually just keeps the answer. And what they found is that if you have these agents debating between each other, they actually converge to the true answer more often than not, improving the performances. So you're getting something out of nothing, which is kind of interesting. And it's better than majority voting and things like that. It's actually something else is happening inside. So, we really don't know what the limits of these models are. It's just quite amazing where we are right now. And now we have also things like generative image models and video models, which are amazing. This is like a video from Sora, which is really spectacular, And this is something we were doing in my group in 2018. We were also working on video models. This is the best we could do. Okay, so the prompt was the yellow circle moves north, and then a blue square does this, and and then you got this video, which is not even great. And this was the best we could do. But what is interesting is that the student that was working with me on this then went to OpenAI and is the lead of this project, is Bill Peebles. And so it tells you something about my skills as an advisor, which I just wanted to get that off my chest. But anyway, this is what it is. So the community's been working, really, really hard into building these data sets with lots of annotations so that you can train computer vision models with them. And one of the things that are really interesting about these generative models and many other techniques in unsupervised learning is that you can actually get rid of the labels, and it's something that took us a lot of effort into collecting. And now you can just train these models with just images, which is kind of amazing. Gansa is a spectacular example, initial example of that capability of learning from images, where you start with a random vector, and this thing has learned to produce images that look real. And one of the things that we wanted to know at the time was, well, how is this working? How is it possible that this neural network creates this image, and has it discovered something else inside? So we were wondering if there were objects inside this neural network that had emerged internally, even though there were no annotations specifying what a tree is or what a building is, but is this localized in the neural network somehow? And this is work that David Bao was doing when he was a PhD in my group. And he went through all the neurons in a big GAN neural network, and then he discovered that in layer 4, unit 84, whenever it got activated, a window will appear on the picture. And the region that is highlighted is the region that this neuron is active for. This is a convolutional unit, so it's kind of localized, and you can check what is the region in which this neuron is actually active. And whenever it was highly activated, there were always windows appearing on the image that got generated. And then there was another one, unit 315, that whenever it will get activated, a chair will appear on the picture. So that was pretty interesting. And there was not just one, there was multiple units that will do chairs, multiple units that will be doing windows. So now one thing that you could do is you have a picture that is generated by the GAN, and then you take all the units that you have identified as being responsible of drawing windows, you turn them off, and the window disappears, and instead a wall appears. That was pretty spectacular to us at the time, because you are modifying the activations in a way that is not natural for the GAN. This is not something that is within distribution, so you could have imagined that here there will be just some noisy pattern appearing or something like that, and instead you put a wall with a painting, with some abstract art, or whatever it could render. So it was quite interesting to see that this was doing something contextually coherent. Yes?
How deep were these units?
This neural network is, I think it was 14 layers.
I meant to ask, like these neurons that were getting triggering, how deep in the neural network were these?
This was layer 4. So when you look at all of the units inside the GAN, what you find is that the most interpretable ones are right in the middle. If you're too close to the Gaussian input, it's really about shaping the distribution into something coherent. If you look too much towards the end, it's all about edges and fine details of the image. The interesting things happen in the middle. In a classifier, it's the contrary. Interesting things happen at the end, and the rest is just less interesting. I'll be showing some examples of that. There were other units that are responsible for drawing grass. So let's say that you generated an image that looks like this. You turn on all the units that are responsible for putting grass in the picture, and then suddenly grass appears all over the place. But interestingly, it only grows in certain places. The walls are not full of grass. It's places that are contextually relevant. And at the time, we were thinking, well, maybe we are just seeing too much into it. But no, it turned out that there is this contextual relationships that emerge inside that is putting grass really in the places where grass could be and not everywhere else. Yeah. But that was some of the initial works that we were doing in trying to understand what these models were actually learning when you train them. And since then, we've been working a long time in my group on trying to understand neural networks and what is the representation that they learn. So these are all the people that have been collaborating in these projects over the years. And there are a number of tools that have been proposed, and a lot of people have been working on this. There is now a big community of people trying to build tools to understand the representation that is learned by neural networks. But one of the things that happens is that all of these tools generally answer only specific questions about what a neural network is doing. What we wanted to have is something that you could take any neural network, any system that you have trained, it doesn't even need to be a neural network, any system that you have trained that performs some tasks, and then we want to be able to ask all kinds of questions. You know, what is unit 45 in layer 4 doing? Or what are the biases in the output of a particular class? Or how many units detect cars? You know, you might have lots of different questions, and also, depending on the answer, you might have new questions. So you don't want to have a system that just does one thing. You want to have something that has the flexibility of current language models, where you can actually have a conversation and they will help you to understand what a system is doing. So this is something we've been working on the last few years, and in particular, Sarah and Tamar. I know that Tamar was here giving a talk, so I took care of trying to have as little overlap with her slides as possible. There will be a little bit of repetition, just so that everybody's on the same page, but I will show you some different examples. But the idea here is to build an agent, so that would be a language model that is enhanced with a set of tools that will help us to perform experiments on a system that you have already trained, so that we can have some understanding of how it works. So some of the tools, I'll describe in a second how these tools will work, but basically the system will start performing experiments on the neural network, and as the result of those experiments, it will formulate a number of hypotheses about what it's doing. It will try to verify those hypotheses, and at the end, it will give you a description of what is the answer to your question. So here there are some of the tools that we use. One of them, a very important one, is you might have, you have a neural network, and there is one neuron that you want to know how it works. So you can take just one input image, you indicate the index of the neuron that you care about, you run it through the system, and it will output just the activation of that unit and the heat map. What is that unit selected for in the image? So this will be one tool. It's one tool that allows the agent to actually interact with the neural network and get an answer about what happens in that neuron when you pass a particular type of input. I'm going to show all the examples on visual domain, but this could be also language. Here is another tool. This one is actually quite important, that we call dataset examplers, and it does the following thing. You take a dataset of images, you specify a unit you care about, and then what this will return is a list of sorted images by the degree of activation that they have on the unit, so from most active to less active, and then the region that the unit is selected for in all of these images. So this allows you to run lots and lots of images through the neural network and just get a collection of few images that seem to be the ones that are driving the unit. And this is something quite popular in image interpretability. Lots of people do this type of things, and it's an important tool to have for the language model. Here is another tool. You can have a stable diffusion. You input a caption, and it just outputs a picture. Okay? This does not interact with the neural network. It's just a way of creating an image that does not exist in your data set. And another tool will be, like, for instance, editing images, like instruct pix to pix, where you take an input image, an instruction of what is the edit that you want to perform, and it outputs a new image, where the only thing that has changed, mostly, is just the thing that you ask the tool to do. In this case, to replace the color with a bow tie. There are other changes, but most of the time, this is pretty controlled. It's a pretty localized change. And this allows also to perform particular edits on the images that will be useful over the experiments to perform some experiments, and I'll show some examples of how that's being used. So what is MAIA? MAIA is the system is the name that we give to this agent that will perform experiments over a system in order to answer questions of how it works. And basically, MAIA is just a long prompt with the library explaining how the different tools work, and then ChatGPT does its magic and runs the whole thing. So from now on, what I'm going to show you mostly is the work that ChatGPT is doing, which is great because we don't have to do almost anything. Just report back the results, and the tool does the whole thing by itself. So let's say that you have a unit that you want to see how it works, and what I will show you now is the sets of experiments that MAIA is going to run in order to answer the question that we pose to the system. So in this case, we are asking, what concepts a particular neuron is selective for. So we have to specify the name of the unit, and so that the system can access that. That's all. So MAIA starts by writing some code. So here is some of the code that it starts writing, and it decides that the first thing to do is to run the dataset samplers tool, which is the one that calls a big database, runs through the neural network, and gets the images that most strongly activate that unit. So here there are the 5 images. MAIA actually gets more. What I'm showing here is just kind of a reduced version of the actual experiment, so that it's kind of easy to understand what is going on. So here there are the top 5 images that most strongly activate that unit, the selective region, and it seems to be selecting things that are round. So MAIA looks at this and it says, oh, well, based on neuron activations and the images provided, it seems that this is associated with images that involve spherical objects and hands. Because you can see that there are hands nearby, even though the neuron is actually not active to them, but in the background there is always a hand interacting with the circular object. So it doesn't stop there. It says, well, let's perform some editing experiments to verify the hypothesis that this is about the spherical objects and hands. So it says, let's do the following thing. Let's use stable diffusion with 2 prompts, a person holding a banana and a person holding a cube. Here there are the 2 images that it generated. So you can see that stable diffusion is not great with hands, but that's what it is. And then it runs this through the system and it gets no activations. So it continues and it says, well, now let's edit these images from non-spherical to spherical, and let's analyze what happens now. So here is the 2 prompts that it wrote. There is a few more lines of code that I'm not putting here. So it runs this through the system. It displays the images. And just to remind you, these are the original images. After the edits, the first one becomes this, which is kind of a strange hand interacting with a ball. Okay, that's the limits of the tools. And the banana becomes like this, which is actually a pretty great image. And then it runs this through the neural network, and it gets that the first one actually drives the unit, the second one also, although not as strongly. And this is just to remind you the original activations that were pretty low. So now it sees that, and it says, well, this indeed, this experiment seems to verify, the hypothesis. So the label for this unit is hands interacting with spherical objects. And just to remind you that this is a conversation with ChatGPT, you can say thank you, and it says, you are welcome if you have any more questions. Just to remind you that things can get off rail, very rapidly. So what I will do now is to show you a few more experiments that are not the full experiment, but just some pieces of them that I found especially creative, because it's quite interesting to see how creative it gets in the experiments that it performs in trying to understand how a neural network works. So here is in the middle of an experiment, it's looking at a unit inside Dino, and it's discovered that the unit seems to be selective for facial features on animals, particularly the eyes and noses. So it decides to create 2 images of an image of a cat's face with clear eyes and nose, so 1 image. So here is the image. It runs this through the neural network, and it finds that the nose indeed is activating that unit with some strong activation. And now it says, well, let's transfer the cat's eyes and nose onto a coffee cup, which I find quite creative as an experiment. Okay, we are doing nothing here. There is no human intervention. The whole thing is just made up by ChatGPT. And here's what it gave us. This is the image that got created, which is kind of interesting picture. Now you still see the face of the cat, but there are clearly no eyes and noses, and it's just a strange image. And this one does not drive the unit much. So it concludes, okay, just it says something about that. Here there is another. It found at some point a different unit inside Dino again, where it found that the unit seems to be selective for birds, possibly with a focus on the head region. So it decides to create 2 images of a bird sitting on a branch. So you can see here how it multiplies by 2. It's using kind of Python tricks to call the image stable diffusion. Here there are the 2 images that it created. And this is how they are driving the activations of the units. And you can see that, yes, indeed, the regions of the head are the ones that seem to be activating that unit. And now it performs the following editing experiment. let's replace the head of the bird with a cat head and the head of the bird in the second image with a dog head. Now it's going to get a little bit scary. Here is the result. Oops. Here are the results.
6.7.
Here they are. So these are the two images that he created. Just to show you the actual thing, let's zoom in. So here there are the actual pieces of the head. So the first one you can see is a cat, a dog. It's just a scary animal. It's pretty creative that it got there, no, to create this fun image. And then it says, well, this actually is, the activations actually drop. This one actually didn't drop too much, but that one dropped quite substantially, so it's just happy with this conclusion of the experiment, and it tells you, just this is a bird head detection. And it doesn't like things that don't look like heads, just.
What are the numbers that you're showing here? What's the
The
range?
numbers here is just the overall activation of the maximum activation of the unit over space. And the scale, the range of numbers depends on the particular unit. They have different ranges, so this is why the numbers don't work from one unit to another. Sometimes it's between 0 and 1, sometimes it's just.
I'm not sure if you might show this later, but I was wondering if there are cases where it proposes a hypothesis but doesn't find evidence for it. And says
Great.
There's no support.
Great. So there are many experiments where it will fail at finding something, and it will conclude, I don't find anything that seems to be driving this unit that I can make sense of it. And because many of the experiments also does it by calling it stable diffusion, sometimes says maybe it's just that it doesn't like generated images. So it's creative on its conclusions, but sometimes has confirmation bias. Sometimes it will do an experiment like the following one, where at some point it found that a unit seems to be selected for different angles of faces. And it generated this image here of a family photo. And you can see that the activations are not on the faces, but it doesn't care. It says, okay, this seems to be validating my hypothesis, which is not. And then it decides to perform an edit, which is to flip the family photo upside down, which really, I have no idea why that will be, but maybe because it's trying to see if it's invariant to the head orientation. And okay, there is very simple code that you can write to flip an image upside down. But it doesn't do that. Instead, it calls instruct pics to pics, which is the wrong tool to use. And it created this image here, which is very scary. And then, it actually doesn't drive the unit much. But still, it says, yeah, it's clear that the activations are all focused around the parts of people rather than other elements. Nothing in this experiment actually support that. And it's just a little bit of confirmation bias. And we saw a bunch of that. Yes.
So you're giving it access to some tools, but it seems that you're also relying on GPT's own ability to analyze images.
Yes.
So GPT also has, presumably, I don't exactly know which version, it also has can generate images.
Yes.
But it somehow doesn't do that.
Yeah. Well.
So why doesn't it just generate the image itself?
That's a great question. The version we were using here, there were no image generation capabilities yet.
But it does have image. It does analyze images.
It does analyze images. In fact, we also provided a different tool, which was the capability of using an image to text.
But it doesn't use that.
And it uses sometimes to get captions, but because at the time, GPT-4v was not that great at analyzing images. If you use current versions, they are really great at generating images very consistently. So I think that we haven't done that yet, but I think replacing this with Claude, it will be much better in the experiments it will perform.
And are the methods used internally inside GPT related in some way to the tools? And do you think that matters, or is this?
I think it matters, but it's hard to know exactly how GPT has been built. You have a question.
So this whole premise kind of relies on the fact that you assume that GTP is good at hypothesis generation and testing.
Yes.
But we don't know that
don't
it's
know.
good at
We don't
hypothesis
know.
generation and
That's
testing.
right. We don't know.
So how do you get out of this loop?
That's a great question. So this whole process is really about, on one side, try to understand what the models do. So at the end, as a user, you get to see the reasoning, because you will get a full plot of all the experiments that it performs, so you can actually kind of check whether it makes sense or not. But it's also a study on, what are the limits of the reasoning capabilities of the systems to actually perform experiments. Here, you're asking the system to behave a little bit like a scientist. And so one of the things that we actually had to do a lot of work is on to build a benchmark to evaluate how good it is. So we, I think in the next slide. So we performed a number of experiments. One of them was to take, in this case was grad students, the same tools, perform the same experiments, and output, what is the description that they think, what is the description they provide for the unit? What is it doing? And they can use the tools in any way they want. So they have to write code and so on, but they have access to the same type of machinery. And what we found is that they were not any better than this system. They were about at par. So if we compare MAIA with previous systems that were also using like language and images to understand what a unit is doing, MAIA was much, much better. And the type of descriptions is almost indistinguishable with what a human does. So it's actually not too bad. But it's not perfect, and there is a little bit of confirmation bias. The nice thing, what I found interesting about this, is that for a human, it takes a long time to do all these things. And it requires a little bit, if you want to make an automatic system that does this, it requires to have a little bit of common sense reasoning, because you're going to formulate some hypotheses about the changes and edits you want to do, and that requires, it's not something that is easy to build in an automatic pipeline if you don't have a language model that actually has some kind of common sense knowledge to know that caps in eyes don't make sense, but that you could actually do it. So that allows you to kind of perform these experiments at a scale. But then eventually you have to go and check. Yes.
Have you thought about like a combination of the two, almost like human in the loop, where you have like something automatic, but then maybe a human is kind of like guiding it at a high level and leveraging the advanced.
I think that's a great question, and that's the dream.
Yeah.
But it still remains a dream. But I think that here the goal really is that you're trying to understand how a system works. This is the answer to one question. Really, it's about a conversation you should have with the system. So once you see these results, you should have a follow-up question. And having that interface to have this back and forth is something we don't have yet.
Yeah.
But I think that will be really interesting, because then you start formulating questions. You can actually question the system. You can disagree with the interpretation, and then perform more experiments. And so one of the things that we've done recently was then you can actually have MAIA perform an experiment. It gives you a description, and then you can take that description, giving it to another agent, and say, what do you think of this description? And it has a simple evaluation tool, and it can tell you, how good it seems to be, and then you feed that back to MAIA, and it runs again, and if you do that multiple times, performance will get better and better. So at that point, I guess they will be better than humans eventually, just because of the patience that you have in doing those experiments, because otherwise for a human it gets kind of boring. But yeah, I think that having that conversation is something we don't have yet, and I think it will be great.
Two follow-up questions. The first one is, how does the model actually come up with the initial hypothesis?
Yeah.
And the second is, for this whole pipeline, do you need in addition to the API and other information you give the agent, do you also need to heavily prompt it to do this turn-by-turn reasoning?
So the first thing is, so how does it create the first list of hypotheses? Well, it does it by itself. So the first thing that it normally does is to run the experiment where it calls the dataset, an entire dataset, and passes, and that kind of gives the seed to create hypotheses. Mm-hmm. But that decision of doing that is done by the system itself. We don't say that that's the first thing that you should do. And sometimes it doesn't do it. But when you start with that process, generally is when you get the best performances. And then everything else is just fully automatic. We don't intervene there. And so the prompt is really just the library and the question that the user has about, okay, what is this particular unit doing? And you can ask other questions. For instance, you might actually know what the unit is doing. I'm not going to show results on that, but you can ask, for instance, what are the failure modes of this unit that is a bird detector? And then it will kind of experiment to try to find which things are, what type of birds this system is not detecting, or it's going to go into a finer degree of analysis to understand what are the failure modes. So it's really about the question.
Does it sometimes give up and say, I have no idea what's going on?
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah. So then I wanted to talk about, this is, one project we are very excited about. There is another thing that I'm, personally very excited about, and sometimes it's hard to convince the students to work on it, but this is a project that I'm very excited, and then I'll show you how both connect. But I think both are related to this thing about trying to understand large vision models. And, we've been doing a lot of work with these generative models in trying to get rid of labels, just so that you learn just from images or from raw text, unstructured data. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to, unsupervised contrastive learning is a great example of, learning just from images. So we know we can get rid of labels. What we wanted to get rid is also of the images. I just want to get rid of the whole thing. What are these models really learning? Because, they work really well. We could get rid of labels. I'm pretty sure you can get rid of the images too. So now for the next 20 minutes or so is the crazy part of the talk. So this is a project that we started with Manel, John Aston, Sue, and Philippe, where we wanted to do learning with n equals 0. People in AI has always been talking that the most interesting training regime is when n goes to 1. Everybody now is working on n going to infinite. I want to do n equals 0, okay? No data. Okay, so you need some data to learn. So what is the trick? What is the trick? There is a trick. So what is the name of the game? The name of the game is that you have a big neural network, and you're going to have some weights that you will have to learn, and that will give you some visual representation that you can use for all kinds of things. Well, what happens if you don't have any data to train this neural network? What do you put there? So, okay, there is one simple trick that you can do. Just put, random weights. Why not? That would be one way of building your neural network. You can initialize the neural network, and that's it. You don't have data to train it, so that's all you have. People have shown that actually neural networks trained, just with random weights, they're already not too bad. In fact, if you take a bunch of images, so this is from a small set of ImageNet, and you use a neural network, in this case it's a ResNet 50, with just random weights, and then you use this to compute a representation, and then you get, you do an image retrieval task. These are the 5 image queries. You look for nearest neighbors in your training set. It gives you images that are not horrible. It got the colors kind of right. It's not great, I admit it, but it's better than chance. So it's not terribly bad. In fact, if you look at performances, so this is an ImageNet classification task, a random initialization gives you around 5% classification rate by just training a linear ledger. So you compute the representation, and then you just train a linear ledger that you train with ImageNet, in this case, and then you get a score. So that actually is not too bad. It's 5%, which is already much better than chance. And you had no data. Yes.
So does it compare to some simple standard feature representation, like from 20 years ago?
Yeah. So it's actually surprisingly like if you use SIFT and things like that, it's not much worse.
Worse?
It's about the same.
About the same. It's not better than but SIFT is a bit better.
There were a lot. It used like multiple kernel learning and so on. There were all these kind of things. Then it starts doing much better. But if you just use SIFT and nearest neighbors, it's not too far.
Wait, you did a nearest neighbor or a linear classifier?
So this is with a linear classifier. So just apply a linear classifier.
SIFT with a linear classifier.
Yeah, just a linear classifier, which is not great.
Right, but if you do SIFT with a linear classifier or SIFT with a linear kernel,
I think that we were getting results that were slightly better, but not by much.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is this a convolutional network?
Yeah, this is a ResNet 50.
Does the architecture matter? What if you have randomly initialized VHD?
That's a great question. We have tried this, and we have tried vision transformers, and I think it was very similar. So it doesn't matter too much, but we haven't compared that particular piece. Yes?
You have local connectivity in both of those architectures, which might resemble kind of local connectivity.
It does. Yeah. You have this, even if the weights are random, you have still compact. So there is a lot of structural prior in these neural networks, and people have shown like the image prior from a neural network that is randomly initialized. people have shown that these neural networks actually, even without training, they already do interesting stuff. So, okay, this is what happens if you train with a database of images, in this case places, so that is different from ImageNet, but you can train with that using contrastive learning and then apply a linear classifier and then you get much better. So, you have a lower bound and an upper bound, and the question is, can we get something in the middle here? So, okay, the other thing that you could do, if you are not allowed to use real data, is, well, you could take a virtual environment. And people have been working on creating synthetic data that looks pretty realistic. And, there are lots and lots of things happening out there. So this is one that we created that we call Virtual Home. But they always have this problem of the gap, between the simulation and the reality. So here is a Virtual Home was an environment where you can control agents and so on. So here is an agent that is, wants to watch TV and have a drink. So, here it is. And you need to get all the details right. Like, it doesn't know where the mouth is. And, there is always this issue that, mimicking reality is just so hard. There are so many details and you need to code all these things. And it's just, very, very complex.
Is this the first drink or is this after a few?
Sorry. There was another really interesting line of work that was, this paper from 2020, where what they showed is that another thing that you could do is just take images that are generated with fractals. And you can generate all kinds of images like that. And if you train with these images, then you get actually performances that are actually pretty good. Still far away from what you get from real images, but over 25%. And this is simple fractals. It's much cheaper than the simulations that I was showing before. Yes.
What do you mean by train on the fractals? Because those are different than the.
Yeah. So there are two stages in this particular experiment. One will be you do contrastive learning on the fractals, so that you don't need any labels. And then in this particular case, because you have a linear readout of the representation, then you train that linear layer with ImageNet.
So if you were to do the same contrastive scheme with natural images.
Yeah. Then you get the bar.
I see.
But of course you need images. And part of the game is I don't want to have images.
Why not?
Yeah.
Well, why not? Because if you have images, then I don't have a talk to give here.
So, but Antonio, this already beats SIFT with a good kernel?
Yeah, this beats SIFT.
With a good kernel.
We haven't compared all the different strategies that SIFT.
No, but
uses,
SIFT with I just mean not a stupid kernel.
Yeah, no, this was
like
probably the comparisons we have done is probably still with a stupid kernel. It's hard to convince students to go so much back on time. Yes.
Is this game about finding data sets that replicate the features that prior to deep learning computer vision researchers built into their systems? Because you've gone from local connectivity to edge and texture structure.
Yes, so.
But instead of designing that into the system manually, you're just designing.
Do you want to give the talk? Yes, pretty close. So that's exactly the story I want to tell. So, okay, so this is pretty cool. So what is that we want to do? What I really want to do is, can we learn from very simple processes? Something like just looking at noise. Can you learn something interesting by looking at noise? Of course, no, it's not going to be noise like this. We'll have some more structure into the noise, but it's going to be something like some simple processes that generate things that if you train with them, you actually learn some really good visual representations. And there are generative models that you could say maybe exist in the brain that actually do something similar like that. So these are recordings from unborn mice in the retina, and what they see is that each of these images is one retina. There are these patterns that seem to move around. It's not pure noise, it's not purely random, there seems to be some structure to them, and the hypothesis in this work is that this type of generative model in the retina is actually pre-training the motion detectors that will happen later. So there seems to be something interesting about the fact that maybe you can start activating your learning machinery before you even have access to real images. So that's the game that we want to follow. Okay, so now is when we go back into the history of computer vision and we start thinking about what processes are out there that simulate images that have interesting properties but that are very simple processes. So one of them is called the deadlifts model, which some of you might know. This was very popular in the 60s. And It was made popular in the 90s, but it was already very famous in the 60s. And it was a process that tried to explain some of the properties that we observe on natural images. And it consists on the following. The way that an image is created is by dropping leaves on the ground of different sizes, different colors. As they are falling, they occlude each other in a particular order. And in this case, the leaves are just squares. So they are falling on top of each other, forming an image like this one. So these are different samples from this dead leaves model. Very simple process, very easy to write the script, and you can generate as many as you want. Very cheap. You want 1 million of them, you got it. Okay, simple. In fact, you can just generate them as you are training, so you never need to see the same images ever again. So what happens if you take these images and you train contrastive learning with them? So you do that, and now you just use it to do this image retrieval task. So there is no fine-tuning, no training, nothing. This model has never seen real images. Now these are the first images it saw, computes the representation, and then it retrieves nearest neighbors, and these are the neighbors. Okay, they don't look as good as before. But there are a few surprising things. This is not too bad. There are a few birds here. This one actually got even a couple that are the same species. It's not too bad. If you look at the accuracy, so because this is ImageNet, you can look at how many times the neighbors belong to the same class, and it gives you around 12% accuracy, which is actually much better than chance. And this model has never seen images before. It's just trained with dead leaves model, which is as old as it gets as a computer vision model for images, a generative model for images. And actually, it gets shy of what fractals got, which is a much more complex process. This is very simple, and it gets around 20% when you use it as a linear without trained, with ImageNet. So what else can we do? You can see that I left some room here, so certainly there is something better. Okay, here is another remarkable of natural images, also very popular in the 70s, which is that if you take an image and you compute the Fourier transform, which hopefully some of you are still seeing in class, and you compute the magnitude, so the absolute value of the coefficients of the Fourier transform, it always drops with a 1 over f profile. That means that most of the energy is concentrated in the very low frequencies of the image, and as you go higher and higher frequencies, the amount of energy drops with 1 over f. This is a remarkable property. I challenge you to take a picture of something in the world that does not follow this property. It's just, it's a really remarkable property of natural images. This is not a property that just noise has. There is another remarkable property of natural images. If you take a picture and you compute a histogram, just how many times every particular grade level happens on the image, you get something random like this. But if you filter the image with a derivative, like a kernel that is a -1,1 that computes the differences between nearby pixels, you get a picture that it looks like this, where in this case grade represents 0, and if you compute the histogram of that, you get these shapes, which are these sparsity priors for natural images in the outputs of zero mean kernels. And this is a really strong property of natural images. This is taking the opposite derivative, you get the same profile. And again, I challenge you to take a picture that if you compute the histogram of a derivative, you don't get something that looks like this. It's hard. You can find it, but it's really, really difficult. So these are two remarkable properties of natural images. So now, what we can do is, go to some very old, work in generative image models that predate most of you, which is this amazing paper from Higel and Bergen that they do texture synthesis by analyzing simple properties of natural images. And basically what it is you can think of this as an encoder-decoder architecture. It's like a diffusion model with just linear layers, one layer that analyzes the image, imposes some statistics and decodes, and then it iterates a little bit a few times, but it's, to you, it's a diffusion model with handcrafted kernels. So it actually will give images that look like this. So you have a seed as noise, and after you impose this to have a 1 over f power spectrum and sparse image statistics for, in the outputs of derivatives, you get images that look like this. And you can generate lots of them by sampling different slopes of the power spectrum and different coefficients for sparsity. You get all kinds of different images. And you can again generate lots of them. Very simple process, relatively easy code to write. ChatGPT can write this code for you. It's that easy. And now you take these images, you train with contrastive learning, and you use it for the retrieval task, and these are the results. This is actually quite impressive. These images look very good. The accuracy is around 25%. These images, this thing has never seen a real image, and it can tell you that these things seem to look alike. It got really close. So this is pretty spectacular for a system that has never seen a real image before. If there are other things you can do. For instance, we know that GANs are really good at rendering images. So they have some structural prior that tells you, what is that makes a natural image a natural image. So we can use this to also generate data. But we are not allowed to train because I don't want to have real images. So you cannot train this GAN. So what we can do is just put random weights into it. And what we found is that if you select the weights in a particular way, putting wavelets in a particular arrangement, it actually starts creating images that look interesting. And the images look like this, which are very reminiscent to the images that I was showing before, but they seem to have something a little bit more. Like if you look at some of them, they seem to have like some shading effects. There is some 3D-ness to them. It's not very strong, but there is a little bit more to it than what I was showing before. And now you take these images, these images there, you train your model with contrastive learning, and you use it as a representation to do image retrieval. You get these neighbors, which actually look worse than the previous one because this was just a random selection of images, but the performances went up. So it's overall better, even though in this particular case just happens to be slightly worse. But I didn't want to trick you. Sometimes it's 33%, it's not magic, still not very good. But you can do better. So this is the performance. This is actually really start getting close to what you can do with real images. And there is still something else here. So what else can we do? Yes.
So the style GAN was untrained.
It was untrained.
Was there something about that particular architecture? Why that architecture?
The why that architecture is because when we did those experiments, that was the state-of-the-art generative model. We have tried to do something like that with diffusion models, but we haven't tried too hard, so we didn't have any success in creating training sets with that. But my guess is that it must be possible. But it could be that diffusion models are too generic and they don't really actually have a good structural prior as style GAN did.
Maybe I'm not familiar with the style GAN, I'm a bit confused. What does it mean for a GAN to be untrained? Because I think of GAN as the training procedure, not the model, right? The model.
That's right. So in this case, the style GAN, we just take the architecture. We don't take the training procedure.
It's just
the
feed-forward architecture that is used in style GAN.
We just take the architecture from style GAN.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly remind us what is exact contrastive learning objective that you're training this with?
Oh, it's just differentiating one image and its augmentations versus the rest.
I see. So do you think that might matter? How
It
you
matters.
do
Yeah.
that?
Yes.
You said there was some special initialization for the style GAN. Can you say that?
There is a special initialization,
Sure.
which consisted in putting kernels that look like wavelets. So if you just put random weights, we didn't have very good performance. We have a more thorough comparison of many models in the paper, and that one of them was the random weights.
So you said with diffusion models you haven't tried hard enough to
We haven't
generate
tried
good. How hard do you have to try with, say, style GAN to get data out to let?
Relatively hard. Yeah. We didn't try as hard with diffusion models. Okay, so what else can we do? What is missing there? Okay. The first thing is that, why is this model working? Actually, if you take patches of these images, they actually look like patches of things that come from the real world. So here is a mixture of patches that we synthesize versus patches that come from actual images. And if you have to guess which ones are fake and which ones are real, well, you can do it, but it's not super easy. So here is the answer. And so these patches actually, at the local level, they look pretty good. Global level, there are no objects, there is nothing, it's a mess, but locally, they are not too bad. So what else can we do? Well, there is actually a big community of people that have been creating what is called shaders, which are very small pieces of code that render images that are generative processes that create images that are quite interesting. So here is one of them. This is the whole code, and it generates things like look like this. So this starts looking a little bit like dead leaves with more sophistication. So one of the things that we did was to collect 20,000 of those processes that generate all kinds of different patterns. And then now you have like a big data set, and you train with contrastive learning using this data set, and the accuracy goes quite high. And these are the neighbors. So these are really, really nice neighbors. This model has never seen real images. It's seen lots of different processes, but are all synthetic, and it's never seen real images, and the neighbors look actually pretty good. And you can actually replace the weights with this, and this is the table that I was showing, and this is the performances that you get with this new data set of shaders, which are just these processes, and it closes the gap to real images quite a lot. Yes.
Have you looked at Retinex-like images like Mondrian and Berlin noise and just combine them and train?
Yeah, we've tried all of these things. So you can take Mondrian will be a little bit like dead leaves, not exactly, and then you can actually replace the colors with samples from textures. That does a little bit better. It gets a little bit more complicated, but yeah, it improves a little bit of performances, and we have those things in the paper, some of those combinations. Yeah.
Do you think we could augment all of these data sets to try to beat the basis 365?
We've tried all these combinations, yeah, but you get a little bit better, but yeah. But we have another one that does a little bit better than this, but so it's getting really close. And the thing is, as soon as you start working on domains that are very different from images, like medical images and so on, pre-training with this is just as good as pre-training with ImageNet. Okay, so just to close, finally, I want to connect this with the first part of the talk, is what is going on here? What has this network learned? So, I want to run MAIA on this neural network, trained with this procedural data, try to understand what are the concepts that have appeared inside the neural network. So this is the experiment. So here is one particular unit. We ask what is the unit doing. It ran a big database. It sees that these are the images that more strongly activate that particular unit. It formulates some hypotheses. This seems to be selective for radial patterns, or maybe things that have a dark center. It doesn't know. It writes more things. So it decides to run more experiments. It creates some images to see what the activations are. It sees that some things drive the unit, some things do not drive the unit. It performs some edits. So these are transformations of this image here to check whether the central symmetry is responsible, whether wavy lines are responsible. It just does a lot of experiments. So eventually it writes some more code to perform some experiments. Here it gets an error because there is a bug in the code, and it apologizes for the error to itself, and it writes the code, and eventually, it just finds a description and it tells you, okay, I think this is what the unit is doing. And we find all kinds of things. There are units that take light sources, but it's really just something like something framed, surrounded by negative space. There is something like wavy lines, and it performs all kinds of experiments. But most of the units here are really just about detecting simple shapes and textures that if you compose them, you actually have a pretty good visual representation of the world, even though it's not something that was inspired, it doesn't come from natural images themselves. So, this is something that we are quite excited about, trying to build models that can learn just from this type of processes. And with that, I will end and thank you.
We can do a few questions.
So the exemplars that you're pulling, like these explanations for the model are going to kind of depend on that? Are you doing this
Sorry,
for
there?
joints? The exemplars that you're pulling in the previous slide, these will sort of depend on, like the model's descriptions of what the unit's responsible for will probably depend on the exemplar set. Like what are you pulling for this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when it runs dataset exemplars, if your dataset does not contain the shapes that actually drive that unit, it won't be able to find them here. So in that case, but the model actually, some of the things that it does is actually using also the generative process. So it can actually generate images that might not be in the training set, but it gets a little bit more complicated because it might not have enough evidence to formulate hypotheses about what it might be. So there is a limitation there. And one of the things we are doing is also enhance the toolbox with things that do things like feature visualizations, so that you can kind of create images that actually drive the unit, so that you can get out of the distribution of your exemplars. So that will address a little bit of that, like that. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's an interesting limitation that I think for humans is also the case. if something is not in the space of things you can experiment with, it's just going to be very difficult to formulate a hypothesis outside of that. But it might not be impossible. But the question is, how did you do that?
Is there a question there?
At the high level, the dead leaves images actually sort of, to me, look more real in that they actually look like, squares on top of squares at the high level than the other ones. The other ones seem to have more like texture-y kind of at the detailed level that, So is there some lesson that kind of the texture detail level is more important than kind of being realistic in terms of things on top of things or including things?
Yeah, I think that what happens is also a question of diversity. And the problem with dead leaves is that all the edges, all the boundaries between objects are all the same, of the same kind. So when we replace the inside, instead of having a flat color, you put a texture on top of it, which could be crops coming from samples from the other models. It does better, but still you have these sharp edges. It improves when the leaves are not just rectangle squares, but also circles and triangles. If you have diversity of shapes, it improves. We also saw that if you put shapes that are samples from an actual database that is annotated, so you have real shapes, it even does much better. So there is something about having enough diversity on shapes that is important, and I think that the other processes give you part of that richness. Okay, let's go here and then.
So it seems like you're kind of redoing Hubel and Wiesel experiments from many decades ago in single-cell recording. And one of the next things that were found, besides the single cell, is patterns in a layer and through depth. Are you finding similar patterns at all in how neighbors respond?
Yeah, so of course there is not the same type of spatial constraints that you have in the brain, because things that are nearby might not do things that are related, so they might be completely far away, particularly in transformers, that things just, there's no spatial organization. But yeah, you find things, you don't find like one unit doing one thing and then all the others doing completely different things. You always find some sort of continuum where there is another unit that does something similar, but with a particular difference. So there might be a unit that is selected for cars, let's say, but it might be cars with a particular viewpoint, and there is another unit that is a little bit more, a different viewpoint, or a different type of makes, or maybe cars that are smaller. So there are a little bit of things like that. It depends how important that particular concept is for the task. You find more or less. But generally you don't find just one unit doing one thing. You find multiple things. Yeah.
One thing I thought was pretty interesting is that this second part of the talk was really challenging the assumption that I think all of us have had for a long time, which is that images have this natural, live in this natural manifold, and things like noise and fractals and whatever, they don't represent the natural distribution of images, and so that is kind of why these neural networks activate in certain ways that makes them good classifiers, even on kind of randomly initialized neural networks. And so I guess what I'm asking is where do you think this is useful? I mean, I can see the medical, or if now you're talking about a completely different domain that's not natural images, like medical images, or maybe the images of a black hole, or different imaging modalities that don't fall in the natural image manifold. This probably seems like the right thing to do, but yeah.
What is this useful for?
But if I have, I guess if I have natural images, I know the manifold of natural images. Maybe the potential of this is that you can just generate so many more things than we have access to natural images for. I don't know.
But that's a very important question, and so I think there are two answers. The first one is the reason why I was excited about this is because regardless of the application, I just wanted to see how far can we go, and because the nice thing about these processes is that they are very simple. Not the shaders, but the other ones are relatively simple. They encode very basic properties. If you can do well, then it tells you something about what these models are actually learning and what is really useful, because there is so much things in that generative process that you are using to train. There is no other thing. So it's a way of trying to get what are the features that are really important for these models to work. That's one thing. But there is actually an interesting application domain. There are a number of things that are important. For instance, these models trained like this, people are starting to use them in things like for differential privacy. Because now this model is being trained, there is no privacy issues, there is nothing. This model has no knowledge. It only has the competence of vision. So it can tell when two things are alike, but it doesn't have any concepts inside. There is no knowledge. So you can actually train a simpler system after that deals with real images using these as features. And there is much more, it's easier to control things like differential privacy or things like being able to opt out, opt in when you are training the model. There are a number of things that become really, really easy and you can have very good control. So people are starting to use these models in that setting. So you lose a little bit of performances, but you gain on a number of things that you can actually compensate by training a simpler model on top of it. So that's kind of an application though.
Last question.
Right. My question is also about applications. So neural networks, I mean, you showed that StyleGAN has kind of prior built into it. Neural networks are kind of prior. Do you think that by pre-training on synthetic data, you can intuitively change the prior of the network to be more appropriate, potentially reducing data requirements and maybe network size? Is that, what's your...
That's great. We have tried using them as an initialization and then doing training on top of it. And I will say that I am not convinced that you actually save much data. Like, you want to have really good performance, eventually you still need like all of the data that you were using before. I think it converges a little bit faster, but eventually, I don't think the numbers actually compensate. But we haven't done like very thorough experiments, and the reason why we haven't done those experiments is my fault, because those are the easy experiments to run, and the students really wanted to go all the time there, and I was always saying, no real data, you cannot do fine-tuning. Like, I don't want to see fine-tuning, because then it becomes a paper about fine-tuning, because it's the easy thing. So that was really the reason why we haven't pushed too much. I know it's important, but it's my fault that...
It's a show about nothing. All right, so on that note, let's say thank Antonio again. You may be able to ambush him at 3 o'clock at tea time. You'll have a little bit of time then.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And the students really wanted to go all the time there, and I was always saying, no real data, you cannot do fine-tuning. Like, I don't want to see fine-tuning, because then it becomes a paper about fine-tuning, because it's the easy thing. So that was really the reason why we haven't pushed too much. I know it's important, but it's my fault that...
It's a show about nothing. All right, so on that note, let's say thank Antonio again.